News media organizations face a daily challenge when it comes to determining the stories that ultimately reach the public. But are we falling far short when it comes to coverage of critical environmental issues? Dr. Bruno Takahashi is Associate Professor of Environmental Journalism and Communications at Michigan State University. He's the Research Director of the Knight Center of Environmental Journalism and an expert in media coverage of environmental affairs and the links between media and policy. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Takahashi.
Thank you, Sharon, for the invitation. Happy to be here.
This season alone has seen several major environmental disasters, from hurricanes to wildfires. What are some of the biggest myths surrounding them right now, and how are those perpetuated?
The coverage of issues such as wildfires, such as hurricanes and other natural hazards are oftentimes connected to larger climatic changes. So when we talk about many of these particular hazards, media organizations tend to make that link almost immediately. It wasn't the case maybe 10 years ago, but we see it much more often nowadays. Now, I'm not saying that there's no link, but I'm saying that it's very difficult to attribute a specific event to climate change. So journalists have to be very careful in making those connections. It's important to put them into context, but saying that one particular wildfire was caused by climate change, it could be problematic. There are a lot of scientific uncertainties, a lot of unknowns that we need to take into consideration before being able to make those links. That's one of the things that certainly journalists have to be careful and not perpetuate those myths. The other thing that journalists need to keep into consideration is that single studies that are produced by scientists typically are part of a larger body of research, and journalists tend to sometimes, in occasions, miss that point, and therefore a study that might find a relationship between two factors might not fit within the larger scope of research in a particular area. Again, going back to the example of hurricanes, there's still a lot of research being done trying to examine that connection between hurricanes and climate change. Some evidence suggests that the level of damage that we're experiencing in the United States due to hurricanes has increased. Part of that is because populations are growing, wealth is growing, therefore the property that is damaged and destroyed is more costly. Now, sometimes that is used as an example of climate change exacerbating hurricanes, but there's also evidence that suggests that the intensity and the frequency of those hurricanes have not changed dramatically in the last several decades. So there is quite a bit of research that needs to be done still to be able to make those connections. And we need to try to, as journalists and people in the media, need to be careful in how we make those connections based on maybe a single study or based on incomplete understanding of a research area.
Well, how typically does mainstream media address rumors, myths, inaccuracies?
That's a very important question nowadays. It's very difficult for news media to navigate the current media environment. And we talk about this current media environment as a highly polluted media environment, which means that we no longer have news organizations telling us what are the important issues happening around the world or in our communities, but we have a variety of different stakeholders and voices in this same ecosystem. Whether they are blogs or YouTube channels or other forms of communications, social media, for example, is a big one. And so journalists need to navigate this ecosystem very carefully because one of the big issues that we see today is that many people do not differentiate between trusted media sources, news sources, and other forms of communication or information. So journalists are in this position where they have to somewhat try to reinvent themselves and reposition themselves in a way that makes them more visible and more trusted. And we know right now the level of trust among the American public is for media organizations, at least the mainstream media, is fairly low. So journalists need to be careful in how they present their information, their facts, taking into consideration that there might be other forms of truths out there and facts that are presented that might run counter to what they are saying. So it's a very delicate balance for journalists to try to make.
Well, without question, though, the biggest questions surrounding environmental coverage have to do with the impact of climate change. It's been called the biggest story of our time, and yet studies show that it receives far less coverage than even entertainment stories. So have pervasive attitudes become entrenched in the media, and how does that impact our understanding of climate change?
That's a great question, Sharon. Now, coverage of climate change really started in the late 80s when Professor Hansen from NASA, Dr. Hansen from NASA testified in front of the US Senate. Since then, the coverage has gone up and down, depending on specific events. So for instance, during hurricane season, in the last few years, we see more coverage because of that connection that I mentioned earlier. We also see spikes of coverage, peaks of coverage during November and December when the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations gathered together to discuss global plans to combat climate change. So we can expect when to see quite a bit of coverage. During presidential elections, for example, and we have one coming up in a few weeks, at least in the last one in 2016, climate change was not part of the larger discussion. Was not really an issue in the agenda, the presidential election agenda. There are fears that this coming election will also miss climate change, despite, again, as you mentioned, being the biggest story of our generation. Part of the reasons why we see climate change missing from the agenda is related a lot to perceptions within media, but also perceptions among the audiences across the country. So if the issue is not perceived as important by the population, news media might not want to pick up on that topic because there might be a perception that other issues are more important. And it is, of course, a feedback loop. So if media do not see that interest among audiences, they're not going to cover it. If audiences do not see the issue being covered in the media, they're not going to think it's an important issue. But the events that we're seeing, the extreme weather events that we're seeing today, and the predictions that we are hearing from scientists suggest that this should be front page news in every news outlet for the next several years. Of course, media tend to favor certain issues over others depending on the news values that they ascribe to, which is, of course, the main reason why the pandemic is front page news. But we also saw the pandemic dropping from that status with the Black Lives Matters movement a few months ago. So it's very cyclical and dependent on a lot of external factors. And climate change has certainly suffered from that across time.
Well, there are two sides to every story, but what are the impacts of exploring both sides of a debate when it is the environment that is at stake?
And that's another great question. And we've seen throughout the years, again, going back to the issue of climate change, which I think it's the most polarizing issue that the scientific evidence suggests in communication suggests climate change is the most polarizing issue in the United States. We see that the research looking at content and media content shows that journalists use this norm of balanced reporting, which is what we teach our students in our journalism schools. Right? You got to have at least two sides to the story, at least two sources, if not more. Now, the issue with that is that in the case of climate change and many other scientific issues, the scientific community overwhelmingly presents evidence that suggests that there is a relationship. So there's a consensus. So that's what we call a scientific consensus. In the case of climate change, some studies suggest that the level of consensus among scientists, and these are climate scientists, by the way, it's around 97, 98%. So that would suggest that presenting the other side would be somewhat a form of false balance. Some of the research shows that earlier coverage of climate change back in the 80s, 90s, up to the early 2000s, used that form of false balance. So there's somebody representing the scientific consensus and someone representing a skeptical position of that science. We've seen in the last decade or so, news media moving away from that form of balance, recognizing that it was problematic, following what we now call a consensus balance or consensus reporting. which means that these skeptic sources are not given us the space that they used to be given a few decades ago, a few years ago. And if they are, if the story demands a skeptical voice, that it's put in context, that it's put in a way, that it's used in a way that clearly suggests that there is a consensus in the scientific community about climate change. And we see that happening in other issues as well. And we can certainly see it in the context of the pandemic, or although it's a little bit less certain, the agreement in the scientific community. But in the case of climate change, it's pretty clear.
Well, environmental issues are critical to our economy, our health, our quality of life. What is happening inside newsrooms that impacts news coverage of sensitive issues like these?
As you well know, news media in the United States and across the world, across many countries around the world, are in a stage of crisis, mostly because of a inadequate business model. So news organizations are in a position where they have to cover issues that really sell. And this is not new, but we see that at least at the local level, newspapers are disappearing every single day. They are in their way to extinction, and that's highly problematic for communities, for local reporting. And we also see mainstream media organizations being impacted financially because of the rise of other forms of communication and shifting attitudes towards news, as I mentioned earlier, distrust of news towards news sources. And that certainly has an effect on revenue in the form of subscriptions and in the form of advertising. So what happened in the late 90s and more recently in this century is that many of these news organizations had to cut certain beats or certain areas in their newsrooms. And for the most part, the specialized beats like environment, science, health were among the first to go. So we went from having specialized reporters, environmental or science reporters within newsrooms in most news organizations to having basically none. So there's a lot more reliance on freelancers today, which could be problematic in the sense that many of the freelancers might not have the same resources that a staff reporter might have. And the same happens in terms of training of those journalists. And many of these freelancers have to report not only on science and environment, but they're reporting on a variety of different issues. And the evidence suggests that reporting on a topic frequently increases the quality of the reporting, improves the quality of the reporting. So it's important to have those dedicated journalists within newsrooms, but again, as I mentioned, the financial situation of many news organizations does not allow them to have those journalists in their staff.
So what do you suggest audiences, viewers, readers look out for in the news coverage that they're consuming with regards to the environment?
Unfortunately, when we look at the content across news organizations, particularly mainstream media, which are still the main source of information for a lot of people, particularly television here in the US, we see that issues like climate change and other environmental issues, whether it's local pollution or local water pollution, do not get sufficient coverage. I mean, there have been some reports out there suggesting that the total amount of coverage of some of these issues account for just a few minutes per year, which is very, very little. Now, if that is the case, again, people are not going to recognize many of these environmental issues as important to their own health or their own well-being. So these news organizations need to somewhat try to incorporate environmental stories across all of the reporting. Most of the climate change reporting that we're seeing now is trying to convey the urgency of the issue in different aspects of our daily lives, whether it's sports and you're in Canada. So I remember a few years ago, some stories coming out from Canada where there was a mild winter and lakes were not freezing. Therefore, ice hockey was an issue. Kids were not being able to play ice hockey because there were not enough ice. So So those kind of stories certainly attract a lot of attention. The same happens when you have celebrities, for example, talking about the environment. That certainly attracts quite a bit of attention. But at the same time, there are challenges in the reporting of complex science-based issues like climate change if you are using a frame such as an entertainment frame. But it's a way to get people to engage with the issue. Now, what people should do or should try to do is, because they are not finding that content in the mainstream media, that forces them to be more selective and have to seek out specialized reporting. So there are plenty now of environmental news outlets out there specializing on these topics, doing great reporting, high quality reporting, but they are more niche publications or niche outlets. Therefore, individuals have to go out of their way to try to find those sources, making it really difficult to really make sense of what's going on in the world. Again, every single one of us, because of our social media use, the use of our cell phones, where algorithms really dictate what we get in our newsfeed, makes it really complex for people to get, again, both sides to the story or multiple perspectives on the same issue. So what happens is people engage in what we call selective exposure, right? So we see people seeking out news sources that already fit with their with individuals' preconceived notions and beliefs of an issue, which reinforces again that idea of polarization that we're seeing here in the U.S. So you only hear what confirms your beliefs, and that is certainly problematic. Or we engage in motivated reasoning, or we engage in psychological processes that prevent us from allowing other forms of information, other positions to be part of our understanding of an issue. We will reject positions that are opposite to ours, and that's part of the tribalism that we're seeing here in the U.S., fueled by the partisan politics that we see day to day. So there's no single solution to this problem. The complexity of the problem will not be solved by more media literacy. It will be not solved by somewhat regulating social media. Although those things will help, there's no silver bullet for this problem. It's a highly problematic issue for democracy, not only here in the U.S. but across the world.
Well, the media undoubtedly has an enormous responsibility given its impact on the policies we establish and the daily choices that each of us make. Dr. Takahashi, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with NewsPoint today. Very enlightening.
It was a pleasure, Sharon. Thank you for having me.